Wow, I'm impressed. You're still alive, still awake, most of you. Otherwise, I will try to wake you up. I will concur with a lot of the previous speakers. I won't take you back to the French Revolution, I promise. I will take you back to the 1980s and 90s in Sweden, to start with. It was, just to set the scene, it was a time of big change. We had still the Cold War, globalization, lots of technological innovations like internet and mobile telephony that we take for granted today. But this disrupted many industries, if not every industry, and not the least a lot of state-owned monopolies. Deregulations and competition was introduced all over, and most of European countries and governments responded with privatizations. Except for one country, Sweden. They wanted to do it differently, as always. And the Prime Minister there wanted to restructure the state assets that was, in this time of change, revealed to be quite colossus on clay feet. And instead they tried to get a poacher termed gamekeeper, and I had the dubious honor to assume that role. And the Prime Minister had made it very, very clear on several occasions, and one very famous, at least for Swedes, when he, in a meeting on Wall Street, how much he hated the private sector business people and bankers. And I came into the room, having been hired. I felt like probably in one of those TV series when you step into the wrong castle and it's only surrounded by people who look at you in a very strange way. And the Prime Minister pointed at my tie and said, "God, I dislike these bankers." It was a nice welcome. Trust. The bridging point for that trust and the dislike, it was mutual, not between me, but between business and politics in Sweden. Because the state sector was absolutely massive. And the thing to bridge this was transparency. We had a 100-day plan to put together some kind of transparency. What is this portfolio really about? And it was a surprise to everybody. And I have since helped many governments, and it is always a surprise, because nobody seemed to have a real understanding of what you own. There we go. And even finance ministers, business people, nobody really knows what they own in a country. I have written a book together with a very clever person, a very dear colleague of mine, and we've tried to put a number on this and come up with the interesting number of 75 trillion. It's a book value mostly for national governments. And the reality is that this is only the tip of the iceberg in many, many ways. One, because most of the value is on local governments. And what we often see, and people like me who work with this, are the corporations. The electricity, utilities, waterworks, waste, trains, post offices, etc. And what most people forget are the real estate. Not in Greece. Everybody's aware about the real estate in Greece. I've looked at it over and over, together with Marius, among others. And, but still, it's still a big unknown. The big change that we did in Sweden was that we didn't talking about the ownership was not an option. So it was all about the yield. And this was a huge change for many people. And it's still a big, a very different way of looking at these things. Yield. It's not a song, it's, it's hard work. And the difficult thing is when you start saying that you want a yield out of public assets, is that people scream bloody murder or even worse, especially if you wear a tie like, or suits like some people do. And you work in a very, very socialist government, and Sweden has been socialist for 60 years, so you're breaking a lot of traditions. It's really like swearing in church. But the simple thing to do is to divide your assets between commercial assets and policy assets. That is the very, very first simple way of making it possible for everybody to agree that you could squeeze a yield out of public assets. Because if you agree, and you always let the politicians decide what is what. But commercial assets is anything that could generate a fee if you manage it properly. Policy assets is very simply things that need taxes to even be run. It's an extension of policy. And the objective of commercial assets is to maximize the value. The objective of policy assets is prudent use of tax money. And I have an example because sometimes this could be difficult. This is done for a US audience, but I think it's a very nice one. It's about a school built back to your times when Bethesda was a farmland and they did a day school there. Today, when this example was used, it's actually done by an IMF economist who I admire a lot, Vittorio Tanzi. And it was worth, the building was worth several hundred $1 million. And what he says was that the value of education is unrelated to the property that you're in. So it doesn't really matter where you are. And this is the whole thing. This is what I did as a banker when you separate operations from properties, opcos and propcos. The private sector has done this ever since the raiders started to look at listed companies that had hidden values. So this is, again, we're not inventing the wheel. We're just looking at things from a different way that has been done in the private sector for decades, but has been prevented to be done in the public sector because we, in my view, we haven't been able to say what is commercial assets and what are policy assets. Once we use that, it starts to become completely clear, or much clearer at least. Amtrak is a wonderful experience. I can give you examples from Europe, but since we are in the US, I think it's polite to use an American example. Amtrak is, I will come to this later, but it's, people say, well, it's listed, it's fine. I talked to people in New York City the other day. Well, we understand this, we got the Port Authority, but everybody knows anything about the Port Authority, it's a mess. Amtrak is a mess. It doesn't matter that you're listed. It's still a messy company. The operations are a complete failure. They're losing money every year. Why? Because the accounting is not, there's no proper accounting. It's not split up in the proper way between what is commercial, what is needed here for policy reasons. All the 50 states that are served need to be there to get congressional support. And it's this what confuses things. If you would split it up in the 400 miles that's serving 26 million passengers and make that a commercial company, it would be perfectly run. And then you serve the 750 miles with the 400,000 passengers on taxes, but you procure them. The other example that is good to use is always post office, because that's the mystery in every country that seems to be so hard to solve, because you have this universal obligation to serve remote areas. But that's not a problem, because you can just split that off and make that a policy company. And the important thing when you start looking at managing public assets for yield, for a return, is that you can actually fund a lot of important things like infrastructure. And this is what countries like Hong Kong, Singapore has been doing for decades, for generations, and they've done it well. But when I usually come into a country and start looking at these assets, one, everybody is surprised that the wealth is so immense. Secondly, that they have a negative yield, as Paul has shown in a number of slides. Even if the accounting is bad, we can still prove that the yield is negative. While countries like Singapore has had a 16 or 17, depending on what currency you're talking about, since inception, 1974. You have even pension plans that are investing in real estate and infrastructure that have 13%. If we, as an experiment, with this book value, the real value is probably several times this 75 trillion. If we only can get 3.5% out of those 75 trillion, we would be able to cover all the infrastructure investments the world is ever needing or can think of that they need right now. We can cover the whole chasm that every politician, not only in the US, is screaming about. The way there is very much about transparency, because no government has any control of their assets. You need a list of assets, you need a market valuation, you need to understand what the opportunity cost is, and then you need professional management, of course. But this lack of transparency guarantees misuse. And I see it every day, and maybe you don't see it, but when I work in a country, I usually fight a lot with the politicians, with the bureaucrats, etc., and there is a lot of wrangling about, even getting transparency or getting this or that out. But when you meet people on the street, they can give you hundreds of examples how this is mismanaged. But at bureaucracy level, nobody has ever seen anything like it, of the kind. For everybody in this room, it's pretty simple what you need, of course. It's a full inventory, market value, and then you can do a business plan. And what I would propose, in addition to the transparency that you do on a country level, which has been done in Greece, it's an annual review of just the assets, just the commercial assets, or the public assets, if you like. Because that would, even if you don't create a holding company, it would make you, as a politician, as a prime minister, a finance minister, be able to look at this as if it was a holding company, and you were running it as a corporation. Because once you have agreed to the term, or to the whole idea of commercial assets, there is no reason why we shouldn't run and think about this as a corporation. And there are lots of examples of attempt for this, and some of them fail, some of them succeed. And the three things that are needed in order to make it work, it's like three spokes of a wheel, and they need to be equally tight. One is political insulation. It needs to be run at arm's length from the government, from short-term political influence. Second one, is it needs to have a clear objective, which is value maximization, because it is commercial assets. And third is transparency. And that's when you get back trust, even from a socialist prime minister who hates the private sector. Because when you start showing this on paper, in good order, everybody starts respecting the process, and you get trust, and you get to do fantastic things. I have some examples for which I think are a little bit over the top, but I'd rather have questions if there are a few minutes left. Go ahead.
Could you take a minute and talk about your experience in Greece?
Sure. I worked in several positions in Greece. I looked at most of the portfolios, the government portfolio, the church, some local governments, and even banks. And there's huge potential in Greece, absolutely, on the corporate side and on the real estate side. But you have to start with transparency, and this seems to be almost like a mystery. It seems like, this is not the only country in the world where it's like this, but it's just, if you don't have this list of assets, and you don't have the market valuation, and you're not, we have done a proper annual review that I usually do in every country that we're working, and it was banned to be published, but it was perfectly all right in every way. And I think this is what you should start with, because then you can start discussing, because as it is now, the discussion in Greece between the institutions and the Greek government is a lot about so many assumptions and about so much fantasy that the law that needs to be created to create the holding company is not going to work, because it's done. It's not done with facts. So you need to produce the law for the holding company if that's going to be a reality, but you need to do your balance sheet at the same time. These are parallel processes. Because otherwise, as the discussion are going, as far as I understand, it's it's still living in an old, and I think the French government people are too much involved as well, or whatever advisors there are. But it's, I'm sorry, but the French doesn't really know how to do this, I'm sorry. But it's still like, you want to create this, you want to get the yield out of this, then you have to have hands off and delegate this properly to a board and to a holding company. There is no in between. And I've gone through this. I've got both my back, I've got scars to prove it on my back, and there's no in between here. And for those, I love to use children as a comparison. But I mean, if you're telling your child this is how you're going to do this or that, and then you suddenly step in and do it for them, it's not going to work. They're never going to take responsibility. If you delegate to a holding company, you have to give them, simple targets, like a yield and this and that. This you cannot privatize, this, or this you can never privatize, or whatever. It's very, very simple. But if you start having making directions to the companies during season, so to speak, then you're killing, because then you're taking responsibility. And this goes two ways, because if a government puts their hand in the jar They're also responsible when something goes wrong, and they will always go wrong. There will always be scandals in companies and real estate as soon as there are commercial assets. And in the last government, I don't care about politics, I'm a technician, but you know, the Prime Minister was in there dealing with every transaction. Politicians were dealing with every transaction because it's fun. But it's not fun. Politicians should just stay away because they will just get involved in all the, because there will always be corruption scandals and all, and let the people who are paid for it take that responsibility. It's much more clever. So there is huge potential in Greece, but it needs to be run by professionals, and it needs to be run with a clear objective. What is it that we want? And this is not happening today, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Again, thank you to our distinguished panel. I'd like to invite our final speakers of the day, Mr.